Awesome. So I would like to officially welcome you to the first event that is organized by the DEI Palette Club, which is a community for DEI enthusiasts that we started pretty recently here at Femme Palette. And the aim of this community is to create a space for DNI enthusiasts where they can discuss different DNI questions, they can meet like-minded people, and they can learn new things. And one of the initiatives of this club is to organize events, and that's why we are here today. And today we will focus on the topic of belonging and how to create it in an organization. We invited two members of our community, Alexis.curtis-harris, who is head of equality, diversity and inclusion at PENA, and also Rachel Luff, who is global inclusion and diversity learning strategy lead at Expedia Group to discuss this topic. But before we actually dive into the questions that we prepared for this panel, I would like to ask you, maybe let's start with you, Alexis, if you could share with everyone your journey into the D&I field.
Yeah, absolutely. So hi, everyone, and welcome. As Lucy said, I'm Alexis Curtis-Harris and the Head of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at PENA. I think my journey, I always think I'm really lucky to be able to do a job that's also my passion. I never really thought those stars would align for me, where outside of work I would certainly say it's my passion to kind of encourage and support diversity, inclusion, equality, social impact, belonging, coming at this from being a Black woman, but also to make sure that everybody is included and on these journeys together. And so I've been working for PENA for 7.5 years now, and over my time there I work externally facing with clients to consult with them and support them on their journeys. And yeah, over the years it's been really, really heartwarming for me to be able to get involved in so many different areas with clients to help support them from a cultural competence point of view, or through to a how do we engage with and appeal to and excite different demographics as well and attract them through a variety of different tactics. But yeah, that's me. But do feel free to ask any questions as we kind of go, or at the end as well.
Awesome. Thanks for the introduction. And Rachel, what about you?
Yeah, well, firstly, thank you everyone for being here. I feel honoured to be invited to speak to you all today. As Alexis mentioned, ask questions throughout. We want to make sure that this is as useful to you, and I also want to learn from you all as well. This is a journey for all of us, and we will always be continuously learning. So yeah, very happy to be here today and part of this community. So my name's Rachel Luff, pronoun she, hers. I'm based out of London. I work for Expedia Group, which is a global company. I'm more internally facing, and I work within our inclusion and diversity team, focus more on the learning aspect of our employees. I run 2 of our flagship learning programs, one around allyship, teaching our employees how to be better allies, what that looks like, and how they can take action around that space, and also another program around unconscious bias, which is actually a podcast series kind of looking at how bias may show up in the workplace and what we can do to mitigate it. So I kind of felt like today was this topic I mentioned before, just as we were kind of just testing our audio and our cameras and everything, that, you know, right now Expedia is going to be moving into hybrid in a week's time. So this is very front of mind for me. So yeah, really excited for today's conversation, but that's just a little bit about me.
Awesome. I'm very excited to learn about those initiatives. So let's start with the first question, and maybe let's start with you, Alexis. What does a sense of belonging mean to you?
So I think first of all, just to say, I really liked when you gave us these questions that you said, what does it mean to you? Because I think actually, I really do believe that what a sense of belonging means is very different to different people. And I'm sure lots of people around here kind of, I can see people nodding along, will totally agree with that as well. And that's the beauty of diversity, isn't it? That's why we all work within this space. So I think for me personally, belonging means feeling safe. And I think that's kind of safe to be kind of unapologetically me, no matter what that might be, safe to be able to kind of both give and receive feedback or commentary honestly without kind of fear of consequence, and safe to kind of show up every day in a way that's natural for me without feeling any kind of pressure to change myself. And I know that kind of people talk about this a lot, but belonging is that kind of outcome, isn't it, from EDI? And for me, it's showing that, yeah, I can exist loudly and boldly, because that is who I am. I am loud and I am bold, and I can stand up and show up in a way that's authentic to me and my identity, and that's what it means to me.
What about you, Rachel? What does it
Yeah.
mean?
I mean, I love that. I think, I was reflecting on this question, and I think it took me back to a time where I worked for a company that I didn't feel like I belonged. I felt like I couldn't speak up. I felt like I couldn't be myself. I was in a very male-dominated space. And I think that contrasting that to where I am today really helped me to see the stark difference of how I behaved and how I was able to show up. And I think for me, it does stem back to, as Alexis said, safety, of really feeling like you can be yourself. It's that psychological safety. That's really where it starts. I think there are other things that come into it: security, support, peace, I think, is a big piece. I've spoke to quite a few people about this over the years. I've been doing this work for 3-4 years now specifically, and it's always for people feeling like they belong is actually an ease. It's more of that. It's just not having to feel like you're having to put an act on, and not having to have that fear and that worry, but just being authentically you. But I do think everything, when it comes to inclusion, diversity, when we look at systemic oppressions, when we look at those that are the most marginalized in our society, it really does start with safety. And I think that's a really key place to start when we're thinking about a sense of belonging. So yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. But for me personally, I think it's really just feeling like the barriers aren't there that seem to be put in front of us. They're kind of taken away, and we feel secure and safe and where we are and the people that are around us, and we feel supported and secure in that.
And let's go back to you, Alexis, now. What are your proven ways how actually we can create a sense of belonging in an organization? How do you create such a safe space that you both mentioned, where people can be authentic themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And I think first thing to say, and I think you did touch on this as well, Rachel, earlier, that we must just acknowledge that we are all on our own journeys towards EDI and belonging. There is nobody, I think, in this room now who I could speak to who could say they are there and they've nailed it, because I wouldn't believe it at all. So I think we need to acknowledge that we're all on that journey, not just as individuals, but if we look at this from an organisational point of view as well. And true belonging should promote and create that sense of individuals aiming to add to culture, not to fit it. And I think that's really important. And especially in the area that I work in, of how can we engage with individuals? There's so much of this person must fit this and you must fit in with us. And we just end up creating these unhealthy monocultures. So we really, for a sense of belonging, must ensure that we're kind of looking at that culture add instead of culture fit. And naturally that ensues kind of inclusion and also will encourage diversity as well. And I think for organizations, I think the best advice I'd say to kind of keep in your mind is that there is no right or wrong place to be starting on your journey, but the key is that consistent and continuous moving forward. Things I often see, and I said I work kind of a lot externally, so work with a lot of different clients, and things I often see go wrong when diversity, inclusion and belonging become a point of compliance rather than culture, when it becomes, or it feels like it's a box to be ticked, and when it actually is really focused on that avoiding overt discrimination rather than celebrating difference, because they are very, very different things. And when you do that, you're focusing on that avoidance of overt discrimination. Of course, that's important, but that can also make the majority feel guilty, which is not the aim in inclusion as well, and can lead to kind of people treading on eggshells and engaging kind of behavior that they'll be doing because they deem it as, and I hate this term, but I'm going to use it, politically correct. And that's not necessarily authentic or inclusive. So everything, of course, around this kind of belonging is about authenticity in every sense of the word. And it's not just about asking people in your organization to change who they are. It's about broadening their awareness, their knowledge, their understanding, their education. And we need to kind of acknowledge ourselves as well, that we're just not going to know everything, and we're going to all have to be meeting each other on this journey. I think the kind of final point on this, I'd say, is a really good way, I think, to begin this journey, or to foster this sense of belonging. So linking back to Lucy's question, is to promote that cultural competence in your organization. And if you've not come across the term, cultural competence will be kind of referring to the ability to kind of interact well and effectively with people from all different backgrounds. It's having that ability to work and develop meaningful relationships with people from different backgrounds, everything that's kind of different to our own. And gaining cultural competence, I do truly believe, is a lifelong process. I really do believe that. A lifelong process of kind of increasing self-awareness, developing social skills and behaviours, and going beyond. I think the key thing is going beyond tolerance, because I think if we talk about the word tolerance, we imply that we're simply willing to overlook difference. Instead, we want to be kind of including and recognising and respecting difference through our words and actions in all kinds of contexts.
And I actually have a follow-up question. So you mentioned that you focus on working with external clients. So what happens if an external client will come to you and they will say that they want to learn how to promote a sense of belonging in their organization? What are your first steps? What do you advise them?
Yeah, so really interestingly, I mean, I think I was going to link this into another question later, but it's a really pertinent point that you raise it now. I think one of the kind of very first things that I would say is important is to, I say collect data and insight, but what I really mean there is to ask for feedback and listen to your employees. And yeah, data and insight is important, but I think that's really what we mean. Ask for feedback and listen to your employees. I think if we look at data alone in isolation, it's kind of worthless. If we look at insight without data, it's basically just opinion, isn't it? So we need that combination of both. And I think, as I said, belonging is that kind of feeling, isn't it, as we kind of talked about earlier. So it is really important to I'll speak to clients and say, you need to ask your employees about their experiences of belonging at work. What could make it better for them? Gather that feedback through multiple different ways, because people will all want to and have the desire to communicate in different ways as well. And then from that, kind of take action also as well off the back of it.
Love it. Thank you. What about you, Rachel? Do you have any proven ways of how to foster a sense of belonging in an organization?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things, like anything, when we're talking around, diversity, inclusion, equity, there is no one single approach that's going to get you to that point. It's a combination, a multifaceted amount of things that are going to help you get there. I mean, I can talk to what we've been doing at Expedia over a very long time, but probably more when our inclusion diversity team formed a couple of years ago. We've really tried to kind of hone in on a few different initiatives that are kind of really been tactical to try and help build that sense of belonging. So first are our employee resource groups. I'm sure many of you have heard of these incredible groups that are within a lot of companies. Now, they're not only great for the business and kind of understanding and listening to different communities, but they're also a safe space for our employees. They're a place where people can meet and see people that look like them, listen, learn. Allies can come in and learn and know that they're gonna learn and grow from those moments and those events and those initiatives. So employee resource groups, I think, really helps, because that is really what's building our culture. It's where our leaders go to when they need to learn. We do something at Expedia Group called reverse mentoring, where we kind of flip it on its head. And it's just a time where leaders are there to just listen to the problems around the business, what it is like to have a marginalized identity within the organization, how that feels, and the barriers that people come across. So we kind of use that to really help shape the culture. It's a really good educational piece, but I also think more importantly, it helps people with that sense of belonging, because they have their community, they have their safe space. So that's one thing that I really do think is important. I'm coming from a company where we're about 10,000, 15,000 people globally, but these are groups that you could start at a very small company to very, very large companies, and they're free to create. So I would really highly encourage that as a part of building a sense of belonging. That's definitely something that we have done, and it feels very authentic because the very people leading them are the ones creating the direction. And I've always found that to be a very authentic way of creating culture and having those and giving that platform for those voices to be heard. So I definitely think that is one of the key things we've done. I think I mentioned this as well. I sit within the learning part of the inclusion team, and that has been a huge culture shift, I would say, bringing in this learning. I think, there is a lot of fear for employees when we start talking around inclusion, diversity, equity. Like, what does that mean? If I say something, am I going to make a mistake? So instead of trying to grow and learn, people just step back and hide. And I think from us giving these opportunities to learn, it gives them a kind of a reason and an opportunity to go, okay, I'm going to get out of my comfort zone a little bit and actually listen to other people that are not like me, have a different background to me. And from that, again, authentically allow people to be themselves because they're able to share their stories. They're able to also listen and hear other people's perspectives and go from there. So those are two of like the really main things that have helped us to grow our culture. I mean, like everyone, we're very new to this journey. There is so much, we're just scratching the surface really, but those are two of the main things that have really helped us to start shape our culture. And actually, when we talk about inclusion, diversity, and specifically when we're talking about workplaces, it is our leaders that help shape our culture. Those are the people at the top making the decisions, creating direction, but really using those employee resource groups and the learning has helped not only our leaders understand the organization more, also understand what we mean when we say inclusion and diversity. And I think it's just really helping to change the course of where we're going as a company and allow people to kind of turn up, be themselves, and feel like they're being heard and respected. So yeah, those are some of the things that we've been doing.
Mm-hmm. And now we can go back to you, Alexis. You both actually mention or talk about authenticity. So how do you actually create a safe space for your employees to be authentic, and how they can actually create authentic connection between each other, especially now in the virtual setting?
Yeah, of course. And I think authenticity is a word that I mean, we've both used it so often already today, and it is used a lot in kind of space of diversity and inclusion. And I think one of the things I'm a big believer is that authenticity is also quite a privilege to be able to be authentic, because actually sometimes this goes back to why we need that sense of belonging, but actually sometimes if we don't have those environments that enable us to be that way, we can't always be authentic or true to ourselves, which is of course what we're all working for. I think when we talk about kind of creating connections as well, I think one thing that's really important to acknowledge is that people will want to connect and experience connection in the workplace in different ways. And what I mean by that is that how I want to connect with my employees versus somebody else could be very different. Neither of us is wrong and neither of us is right. And we need to kind of understand that when we're kind of talking about workplaces. I could sit here and say kind of there's a one size fits all, and I don't have the universal solution, I'm afraid, for you, but it's kind of really understanding and going back to what I was saying earlier about listening to kind of our employees. And I think as well, we often kind of link kind of connection to communication, and again acknowledging that there are many people with different backgrounds, different disabilities or neurodivergent conditions in particular as well, who may not have communicate in the same way with us. And so how do we ensure that we're not putting that one size kind of fits all rule in place there? So I would say kind of the advice here, to link back to kind of where I responded to your question earlier, Lucy, around that we just need to internalize and ask and listen and understand kind of what our employees want. I think, especially where I work with so many different clients and external people, a solution that I might provide to one is not going to be a solution to another, because they have a different culture, they have different behaviors, they have different values. They all want inclusion, but they are very, very different in themselves. So I'd always kind of say, to start with, you need to sort your house out first, and doing that through, as I said, kind of data listening, surveys, conversations, multi-channeled, of course, because again, people communicate in very different ways. But then the important thing is that kind of taking action. And I'd say so much as measurable action. I'm always kind of speaking to my clients about, that's great, but what's the measurement of success? How do we look back in a year and know that we've done something well or not done something well. And so action is not that kind of one-time thing. It is continuous as well. It is evolutionary. But measuring kind of inclusion and belonging so you can benchmark your performance over time will go a long way to kind of supporting your employees with creating those authentic connections with each other.
Mm-hmm. And what happens if you find out in your survey that people actually want different things? What do you do then?
Yeah, and I think that's about kind of then not saying we create like lots of different kind of mini companies in one, but it's how can we kind of enable people to know they've been listened to. So when I say we kind of get feedback, we feed that back as well and let them know how we're going to prioritize what they've said. We know that organizations are never going to be able to make 50 changes in one go. I'd be very impressed if they could, and also kind of wonder how well those changes might go down. But it's about kind of doing things in tandem with your employees as well. So we often talk about kind of course, leadership comes from the top. And when we're talking about EDI and belonging, we need to see that strong leadership from the top, but we need to encourage everybody in between as well to feel like they have that power in their voice. And actually by kind of asking them what they feel they want and how we can go about it, feeling that they're included on that journey, and again continuing to talk about that journey, I think is really, really important.
Mm-hmm. Great. So let's move on to you, Rachel. How do you help your employees create authentic connection in person and also in the virtual setting?
Yeah, I mean, listening to everything you've been saying, Alexis, like I'm just nodding my head so much because it's just something that we're doing the same. You know, data is so important to us. It really helps inform our decisions where we're going, but also helps to identify gaps that we've completely missed. You know, we're only a small team and there is so much that we don't know. You know, there are offices we're not in. And I think that relates to your question, Lucy, around how do you create connections, especially when you've got two very different ways of communicating, in person and virtual. Now, I know when I'm in the office and I'm in person and the way that you're in a meeting, and sometimes it's just a look and that's a communication, or it's a body language, or it's a tone of a voice that you might not actually pick up on a camera. It's a very different communication style to that virtually. And then, as Alexis mentioned before, that's not even considering people who may have a disability or be neurodivergent. And I think it's really important. And I really love the way that you worded this question when you kind of really picked out virtual and in person, because they're very different. And I think it's really important as we're moving into this new way of working as such. For some people, it's always been virtual, it's always been remote. But as people are talking about, you know, now that we're kind of moving back into that, and I mentioned right at the beginning, I referred to the fact that next week, Expedia is moving into this hybrid way of working, is really making sure that it doesn't matter how we're working, doesn't matter whether we're in the office or we're virtual, that everyone is included. Now, there's a lot of ways that we're trying to, you know, test and learn, I guess, along as we go. And I think, you know, this conversation is really just the beginning. And there is stuff that I'm probably saying today that in a year's time I'll be going, that didn't work for us. However, this worked really, really well, and vice versa. So I think connections, especially at work, always start with trust and respect, as they should in any way, any form of life, inside, outside work. So I really think, you know, my advice here for creating authentic connections is really trying to have that base level of trust and respect. You know, it's in everyone's, or I like to think it's in everyone's code of conduct. When we speak to our employees about creating connections with our employees, start with that level of respect, that level of trust. You know, there are going to be things about people that we don't always understand, and that's okay. But just start there, start with that level of respect and trust. And I think that really helps to start conversations. You know, you can suddenly go in and you go, oh, this isn't as hard as I thought. Of course, I always treat people with respect and trust. You know, I like to think that I do, and that's how I approach my life. And that really helps people to go, okay, let me just try and be myself here and connect with this person on a very, you know, how I would operate anyway. I think that helps with connection. I think actively listening. I think it's very easy sometimes to ask questions and not really listen. And that's something I'm really actively trying to do myself, is if someone's asked me a question or I ask them a question, really taking it in, and whether that's virtually or in person, listening to that response. You know, we're moving into this new way of working, and there are going to be some times where, you know, I have teammates where I can ask them, can I support you with this, you know, transformation, this change? But then sometimes, what am I actually doing after that? Have I just asked them and I don't have any action coming from it? Then I have really just asked a question that I don't really mean anything by. How is that going to create a real connection? And then thinking about those people that may also feel a little bit more excluded. I mean, moving into this new world, we're going to have people where, you know, a lot of more people are in the office. So you're going to have a team meeting, but there might be one person that's virtual. What are you going to do to make sure that one person that's virtual feels just as included as if they're in the room? How can you make sure their voice is amplified? How can you make sure that they feel just as prepared? It kind of goes back to the glances in the room, in person, those side conversations. Are we behaving in the best way, the most inclusive way? Those are the real ways that we can create connection, is really trying to behave more inclusively and being aware of how it differs between in person and virtual. And I think we're all going to learn through this. You know, Expedia has been, you know, when the pandemic happened, we were all quite already a virtual company anyway. There was a lot of flexible working. But it means that we're kind of going back to just being completely virtual to in-person and virtual. And I think we've all got a lot to learn of how to facilitate conversations and even events. So yeah, it's going to be a long journey. I think there's a lot to learn. But yeah, just keeping very mindful of that difference and making sure that those that are more remote or virtual feel just as included.
Can you maybe share with us some tips, what you already tried that worked or didn't work for the hybrid setting?
Yeah, so one of the things that I've done in my team, and it does work really well, is if you have the majority of people in the office and say just one person remote, is actually make sure everyone logs on their own laptops in the office. And it might sound strange because you're like, but you're all in person and there's just one person that isn't with you. However, if you can sit at your desk or, you know, go into a different meeting room or whatever it is, as you would have normally done, and you all then have exactly the same equitable kind of voice in the conversation. So that's something we've tried. You know, some people love it and some people are like, oh, but I like being in person. That's what I want to do. It doesn't have to be that you do that 100% of the time. But if you have someone that's based in a different office and they're there on their own, that can feel very isolating. And I'm sure we've all been in a situation where, or maybe not, but I've definitely been in a situation where everyone else is in person and I'm the only one that's virtual. And it does feel very different. So I think trialing things like that, like can we all just be logged on our Zoom rather than in person, just one person? That's been something we've done. We actually at Expedia Group have created resource guides as well to really help employees to be more inclusive and be more mindful of this. So definitely something that you can take back to your organizations is just a bit of a checklist of like, have I sent the agenda around beforehand? Have we set up the meeting to ensure that all of the voices are going to be heard? Are we making sure that we're amplifying every single voice in this conversation? You know, those are the kind of tips and things that we can try and do that are preventative to making people feel excluded rather than kind of having to react afterwards. So yeah, those are some of the things. I think the last thing I'll say is when we're moving into this hybrid way of working, if you're putting on an event in the office, what else are you doing for those that are remote workers or are virtual? Are you going to give them something, or is there a way that they can join in and feel included? An example being that we did like a photo contest. Anyone can join that. It's a virtual thing that you can do. You don't have to be in the person to participate. It's something that's completely virtual. So just being a bit innovative with the ways that you engage as a team, as colleagues, I think is super important. And actually, it tends to be really fun as well. Like you can really make things fun when you start to think about new innovative ways of working with one another. But yeah, hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah,
I was going to say, if it's all right to just add on to that as well. I thought that was brilliant, Lucy, what you said there, and I was doing the nodding along with you as well. I think a really important thing when we talk about these kind of split teams or hybrid teams is to ask people what they want. And I know you've kind of touched on that, like, oh, we might have trialed this and we trialed this, but it's ask people what works for them. So even things like, I don't know what it was like for everyone here, but when we first went into lockdown, everyone had their cameras on. It was a novelty. It was like, oh my God, it's brilliant. And then slowly people started to switch their cameras off because it got a bit samey. Now I've got one of my best friends, he's hearing impaired, and he said that he struggled so much to do his job every single day because he relied on lip reading when he wasn't in a room. And so simply, we kind of did a bit of talking around the teams, and we said, right, we're all going to put our cameras on. We're not going to wait for him to join and have to go, hi, I've got a disability, so I want this. It's just now known within our organisation that we do those sort of things to support people so they don't need to ask of them. So I think as well, we just have to kind of be conscious of when it's like something like a celebration, like you mentioned there, that we're not, again, trying to enforce that forced fun, but actually asking people, what would you want? If we're going to do this, actually, you're not going to be in. Would you rather we pay for your travel to come in the office that day if you want to, or would you like to even just join virtually so you can see? What about if we record it and send it to you afterwards? Or actually, do you just not want to be involved and you want to receive the notes? But it's just giving those options, I think, helps people not feel they kind of have to jump in and join in with things, and maybe kind of sit there when they can't quite hear or they can't quite see, or take part in something that actually makes them feel really uncomfortable because they kind of have to. So yeah, I would just add that on the end as well.
We also got a comment from Amanda. Amanda, would you like to share it with everyone, what you mentioned in chat? Feel free to also jump into discussion. This can be also a bit more interactive. So if anyone has any questions, also please feel free to unmute and ask those questions.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yep, we can. Hi, Amanda.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm really enjoying this so far. And as somebody that's managed remote teams for a long time, it's really interesting just to get insight from so many different people now that it's such a common thing. I really like the last point as well, that it was mentioned about even something simple like a celebration, what that looks like for people is different. And not assuming that everybody wants to have a big in-person gathering or a Zoom gathering. It's like everybody experiences things differently. And that was one thing that I learned, even just with things like communication, you know, how people want to share feedback, how people want to be recognized, how people want to communicate day to day, and not making people that are maybe less outspoken or that have less interest in engaging socially to make them feel any less. It's like, let everybody show up how they're comfortable to show up, and they're going to do their best. And that was, I think, why a lot of our staff have been with the company for 10, 15, 20 years, because just showing up how they're comfortable to show up was okay. And I just think there's just so much value in that. And that's why I wish every company would offer at least hybrid options, because the more flexibility, the better, and people produce so much more, not less. So I'm just happy to see less fear around those flexibilities and people engaging in these kind of conversations. So thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Awesome. So moving on to my next question, I would like to also open up the topic of sense of belonging on the team level, because many times this is something that the team leaders or the managers are the ones who are responsible for. So I would like to ask you, what do you advise to these leaders, how to be more inclusive? And let's start with you, Alexis.
Oh, so leaders being inclusive. So I think to start with, if I focus on the sense of inclusion for teams, I guess regardless of individuals' backgrounds and experiences, I'd say that leaders need to know how to become comfortable with the uncomfortable. Now, I know I'm saying that's a really simple thing, like a switch, and you're like, I'm so comfortable with everything, and I'm aware it isn't. But there are many barriers that can initially make us feel uncomfortable, not just as leaders, but I'm kind of speaking at this as from a leadership point of view, with sometimes speaking up or engaging in conversations with our teams and our colleagues, which can then prohibit that sense of inclusion for all. So you might be nervous to speak up because you feel like you don't have the knowledge about a situation. And I'm focusing this around kind of inclusion and people with different backgrounds, or you don't belong to an underrepresented group, so feel that you maybe can't speak up on certain topics, or when you do, you have that fear of saying the wrong thing and scared of judgment, for example. But there are ways that we can kind of break down those barriers. And I say ways we can, I think ways we must, really, as individuals and as potential leaders across businesses. And I say to leaders in response to these questions that just acknowledge you don't know everything, acknowledge you're going to make a mistake, but know what you can learn from that mistake. I run a lot of training on inclusive communication, and I think one of the main things I say is, no matter how many sessions we go through, you're going to say the wrong thing at some point, but it's what you do in that situation and what you learn from it is then how you move forward on your journey. So meet people around you as well where they're at on their journey, and listen to those lived experiences of others, and not just those in your team, but I mean, even sessions like this are brilliant because we're all hearing from each other and are all different experiences, and we know we can all educate ourselves, and we can all kind of increase our depths of understanding and therefore our ability to feel comfortable by reading, by listening, by educating. Again, people learn in very different ways, but by actively supporting causes. And just finally, on that kind of uncomfortable feeling, I think the more and more you have these conversations, the more comfortable you'll become. And I think that's just a fact. And as leaders, I think to ensure inclusivity, we need to acknowledge that, as I said, that we're going to have difficult conversations. And you know what, as leaders, you might sometimes have to start those conversations as well. And don't get me wrong, and no matter how long anyone's done a job, I'm sure when a conversation comes up that you might not want to have, it feels tough, and it requires openness and bravery and that ability to kind of work through discomfort in some kinds of cases and express views in a very non-combative way. And most of all, it's just about how can we as leaders listen without judgment. So I'd say to kind of any leader out there struggling with inclusion with their teams is to speak up, not over. Any leader's job, well, any ally's job, I guess, but any leader's job in particular here is to support and to use their impactful position to educate others, but in a way that doesn't speak over the community members that they are supporting. So it will be inspiring to employees to see examples from leadership committing to listen, committing to learn, and committing to act with greater empathy and emotional intelligence within these situations. So to leaders, I'd say kind of take the lead on issues that require kind of a deep awareness. And most importantly, we must take actions that back up what we're saying as well. I think a lot of times, and we've seen this a lot over the last few years, that kind of talking about silence or lack of acknowledgement about issues in society can sometimes mean that silence can be deafening, especially from leadership. And usually people see silence as being aligned and being complicit. And actually, a lot of cases when you speak to people, that's not the case. They just aren't sure how to communicate what they're trying to say. And there is so much power in allyship, in leadership, in solidarity. And as leaders, our kind of words and support are crucial in these cases to cultivate that sense of belonging for everybody. So just to everyone, I would say, listen. I mean, it sounds silly, do your homework. In order to learn, you need to listen and know when to allow another person's voice to fill the room and to believe them wholeheartedly. And yeah, I know it takes a commitment, but it's a commitment that I think as a society, I don't think we have an excuse not to do anymore. So it's just about kind of listening, learning, and kind of supporting those around us.
Love it. What about you, Rachel? How do you advise leaders to be more inclusive?
Yeah, I mean, everything Alexis said was perfect, and I don't want to repeat. So I'll just build on this. I think role modeling is key. You need to be the person to act inclusive. Otherwise, the rest of your team may not. So you need to make sure that you are that, that's your responsibility. You need to be role modeling. So if that's educating yourself, other people are likely to follow you if they see that you're doing that. If you are, chairing meetings in an inclusive way, that just becomes the norm, that becomes the expectation. So I just think everything that Alexis was saying is really just, you've got to role model that behavior. And yes, you're going to get it wrong. And that's the whole part. That's a huge part of inclusion, diversity, and equity is we're going to make mistakes and we're going to learn from those mistakes, and they can feel hard. I've made so many mistakes in my lifetime, and they are hard, and you will sit there and you'll feel awful. Like how have I got this wrong? Like, I know better. but then you learn from it. And as long as you're changing your behavior because of the mistake you've made and you're owning it, then that's all that you can do, and that's you growing. So I think the mistakes part as well, Alexis said, I just wanted to highlight that. Like I completely agree. Like I think that's important. So role modeling, definitely. Really owning your mistakes is another one. I think the other one for me to just build on is accountability. I think a lot of the time leaders think inclusion, diversity, equity, belonging, it's a bit on the side. It's like, well, I have my day job and I have to do everything. And then we go to these leaders and say, well, are you able to speak up about this? Or what have you done? Or let's have a look at your data of your engagement. And a lot of the time they're like, I don't have time for this right now because we've got these programs and these timelines happening. And we're like, being a leader is looking and being a leader is really having people that follow you, but also you're the one that's behind pushing them forward. That's really what a true leader is listening to the very people that are reporting into you and really helping them to build and support and for them to grow. That's what a true leader is. So if you're not prioritizing inclusion, diversity within your work and within your responsibility, then you're not really a leader. And that can be, I wouldn't say it as bluntly as that to leaders, but really trying to get them to be accountable, to understand that this being inclusive is part of their job. It will make employees feel like they belong. Therefore, it will make them work more productively. It will make them be able to be the complete self and innovate and be effective and efficient and build more connection. Like it's just like this, it's just this kind of ripple effect that goes from there. So I always kind of go back to that accountability point. Like firstly, as a leader, be accountable to yourself and how you're role modeling yourself, but then also your teammates and your team members, keep them accountable. Like, have you got any goals or targets around what you're doing as a team to be more inclusive? Like, what are you doing? How about you have a monthly educational session as a team? One of you brings along a resource and you all talk about what you learned from it, like a TED talk or a book or something. Like, what can you do as a leader to help the education within your team? Do you have a team charter? Is it inclusive? Are you following that practice? Like, there are so many things that leaders can do today that are part of the practice of just being a leader. So yeah, really trying to change that mindset away from I&D as something separate to be a leader, you need to be inclusive, because until everyone is along in that journey with you, you're not a leader. And just kind of really thinking that through and helping them through that mindset, I think is key to being inclusion and in the leadership world anyway. Yeah. Oh, I think you're still on mute, Lucy.
Sorry. I was saying that this was a great ending of this panel. I would like to actually open it up now to questions because I would also want you to have, I see Cristina, you have a question.
Yes, thank you so much for your wisdom and your real life experiences, Alexis and Rachel. I wonder how you handle a situation when, for as long as we are not aware of biases, we don't know what we don't know, we just have coping mechanisms. But once we start to discover when people are projecting biases on us, we start to become perhaps, more reactive to these things. So I wonder how you manage that, how you help people to stand in their power, dealing with, projection of bias, perhaps with exclusion, but without becoming emotionally reactive and literally too, snowflakes. How do you manage that?
Yeah. Do you want to go, Rachel, first? I've gone first every time.
I'm happy to just say, I'll just say my part. So I love the question. I think it's an important one. If I had the complete solid answer, I'm sure that I'd be getting a Nobel Prize or something. I think bias is a very complex and interesting, nuanced thing. I think if people are feeling like bias is coming up and they're feeling targeted, that is a horrible place to be. And I think, if it's something that you're feeling personally, then I think there are depending on the support system you have around you, it's definitely right to leverage it. Coming from, like a practitioner's point of view, the things that we're doing at Expedia to try and help support employees that are feeling that way is we have, like I mentioned at the beginning, an ally skills training. So at this current point, we've had over 50% of our employees go through that training. So for that very situation that you just proposed, I would hope that an employee would be an ally in that moment to recognize the bias there and be able to step in as an ally. But, you know, we're living in the real world here, and allies don't just aren't at every corner. And sometimes, you know, it's a situation where no one does step up. I think it just comes down to, you know, the person's comfortability. If, you know, I would say speak to HR if you're seeing bias constantly showing up. That would be my first reaction to protect the employee, is to bring that up and where that bias is coming from. But yeah, allyship, I think, is a super key thing there that we're trying to do. We also have a podcast series as well, because I think bias shows up in so many different forms, not just in like a conversation, but in promotional decisions, opportunities, feedback. It happens all the time, and we're trying to mitigate bias all of the time. So rather than posing questions around, you know, like what is that person's potential, because there can be a lot of bias in that question, rather than reframing questions to be more like give evidence. So if you're giving feedback, it needs to have evidence. So really framing the way that feedback is given to ensure that the bias is trying to be mitigated as much as possible. Hopefully that helps. But anyway, Alexis, please do add.
No, that was brilliant. I mean, you said quite a lot of things I was going to mention there as well. And I think it's so true. And I know so many organizations will run different elements of training around kind of unconscious bias. And I certainly think these things have their place. I think whenever I'll kind of do these kinds of trainings, I'll try to complement that particular one with conscious inclusion, because I think it's all very well telling people these are your biases. And it's like, okay, now I know that, it's like, how do I stop doing it? And so that kind of conscious inclusion element, I think I kind of linked to it a bit early when I talked about kind of cultural competence, but I do think there's a lot that we can start to help ourselves as individuals and help our colleagues as individuals kind of interrogate ourselves. And that sounds really kind of dramatic, doesn't it, to interrogate ourselves, but that self-awareness and self-interrogation, active listening, does kind of help us kind of understand kind of where our biases are and help us understand those around us as well. And so like whether we're asking ourselves like, have I actually ever unintentionally done this? And you might not think you have until you kind of start to self-interrogate yourself, or actually, what might I actually be in denial around kind of different levels of inclusion? And I think that when we kind of start to self-interrogate ourselves, we'll start to understand what our areas of privilege are. And I know there's been so much conversation over the last years, in particular following the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, about privilege and what is privilege. And I know there was a lot of conversation about white privilege, and I always kind of I've run lots of sessions around kind of Black Lives Matter in particular, and I think just explaining it in case anyone is still kind of unsure on that, is that privilege in any sense does not mean your life has not been hard. It does not mean you've not fought for every single thing you have. It simply means that one kind of point is not the thing that's held you back. So if we're talking about white privilege, the color of your skin is not what's held you back. And I think actually when we start to understand our own privileges, I'm sitting here in front of you as a Black woman, I have many privileges. I have many areas that I don't have privilege in. When we start to kind of understand our privileges as well, I think that helps us to kind of take the opportunity to amplify the voices around us and understand that those who may not have access to those spaces that we do, how can we bring them into these spaces moving forward? But sometimes it's just that self-reflection is where we need to start.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
Question, Cristina, and the answers. Anyone else has any questions?
I kind of have a silly question, considering that I've been off camera for the majority of this meeting, but it is in relation to camera because I thought it was an interesting topic about inclusion in meetings where you have some people who are in the office and some people who are remote, and how to make them feel inclusive. And I wrote down your comment about everybody having their laptop, right, in order to have kind of the same platform for everybody in the room. And I think something that I've struggled with when I'm talking to either large groups of people or even small groups of people within the organization is when people don't have their cameras on, especially if it's a serious topic of conversation. But I never questioned myself until this very moment to think, if by me demanding to have the camera on, am I thereby being, am I not being inclusive to those people who don't feel comfortable on camera? And is it my own uncomfortableness that makes me insist that people do turn their camera on? So I'm just kind of curious what your take on that is, more than anything, because it's something that I've struggled with, whether to make people do it or not make people do it. But our customers now, in many cases, are actually asking that our employees turn their camera on. So if they're not turning their camera on for my meetings, which I'm a leader in that organization, then what's happening when they're having to work with customers or clients?
Yeah, that is such a good question. And I would, again, I don't have the absolute answer, but I can tell you my journey I've been on, because it comes up in conversation no matter who I speak to, because it's one of the biggest things. And I think there's been I think there was a lot in the news a couple of years ago around kind of people maybe not putting their cameras on from different levels of social mobility as well. And maybe their Wi-Fi wasn't strong enough, or actually maybe they were in a living situation that they weren't comfortable showing on camera, different disabilities or abilities and things like that. And I think I've had companies and people come to me and go, my MD is demanding we put our cameras on, and that's made me not want to do it even more. I think where I've seen it kind of work well is where there's that level of encouragement. And as I said earlier, that kind of sense of belonging is knowing you can give and receive feedback without fear of repercussion. And actually, I think as an organization, if we're making people aware and go back to that self-reflection of actually how you are supporting another individual by putting your camera on, not having to have them to ask you to put your camera on for any kind of reason, I think hopefully, and it goes back to culture, that you're encouraging those to do it, not demanding, but encouraging. And I think tech has come a long way as well since then. Like, we know we can blur our backgrounds now. I think with the hybrid working, actually, maybe you can go in the office if you have a really important meeting, or if you really are uncomfortable, you can speak to your manager and say, I'm not comfortable putting my camera on. But I think it's that kind of, how can we cultivate those cultures where people feel free and able to be able to share their concerns or share their beliefs or share what their experience is, and know that they're not going to be kind of put down for kind of speaking up about it.
I love that. And I would just add, because I think you just answered that brilliantly, whenever we're trying to, push a working style or a way of working or a new structure, always ask yourself why, as the starting point. And when you have that answer as to why, like, why is it that I want to see everyone on camera? A lot of the time it's engagement, it's being able to read people, it's being able to communicate. And a lot of the time, putting that in your communication reassures people, and that might help with their uncomfortability. So being able to say, I would love it, rather than saying it's required, because I think the moment you require something is when people will sit back. But the moment you say, I would love it, and we highly encourage you to put your cameras on, because it will help with the conversation, it will help build communications and connections, I think really helps people with that. Because, we had the same at Expedia Group. I mean, before the pandemic even hit, there was a lot of people on cameras anyway. We're a very global company, but everyone had their camera on all of the time. That was just a cultural thing at Expedia Group. But then the pandemic hit, and to your point, Alexis, around like socioeconomic status, a lot of people I don't really want to share my home. That's very intrusive to me, which is why I have a background right now, because I try and encourage that people don't need to share that. You don't have to do that. And I think that helps quite a lot. So kind of implementing those things and listening to why people might not want to put their camera on is also really helpful. It might just be like, I have Zoom fatigue. I've been on meetings all day. I just want to just listen, and I will just speak up when I need to. It might be that I have caregiving responsibilities, but yeah, really kind of understanding what the purpose of the camera having it on, and then sharing that with the audience, and then also putting in practices that will help it feel more inclusive. So having a background that you can share with people or helping them understand why, I think will really help that. But I love that question, because it's even you being vulnerable and saying, I had to check myself then of like, why am I doing this? And what does that mean? So I really appreciated you sharing that. So thank you.
Thank you.
I also see you put a comment into chat, if you wouldn't mind sharing it with everyone. No?
Who?
Oh, Cristina, I saw that you
Oh,
put a comment in the
pardon me.
chat,
I
so I want
also
to give
didn't.
you opportunity to also explain it a bit more.
Yeah, thank you so much. If we if we go back to the biology of how we bond and how we trust each other, how we relate to each other, we need oxytocin for that. And this hormone can be released in our brain when we have at least two of our senses stimulated, right? The best is when we can hug each other, when we can touch each other, we can sense each other. But when we don't have this on a camera, at least we have the hearing and the visual. So if we understand the biology of human bonding, and if we want to have trust and connection and, long-term relationships, even when we work remotely, then it's good to have, cameras as often as possible. But I totally agree that the why of the manager plus the context of the participant is the real recipe for success. And I believe that we should honor them both. Thank you.
Awesome. Great. So we are at the time. I would like to thank you, Alexis and Rachel, again for being here with us and sharing all your tips. And yeah, it was a pleasure to have you. And we are going to be organizing more events like this. So we hope we will see you again at the next event. Thank you again for coming, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.